my focus then kind of shifted to actual sports cars. So there are very few cars that I would consider that had an automatic transmission. So the GTR was one of them, and then a bunch of the AMG Mercedes are the other ones I was considering. Now GTRs, you couldn't really find a good and reasonable example at a decent price, especially not within my price bracket. And the AMG Mercedes, again, that was more of the daily driver that had a lot more of the luxury aspect to it, but I can't quite justify driving a Mercedes AMG around. I'm just not that bougie. So then the repair costs and stuff comes into a factor. Like I said, $35,000 was kind of the top end of what I was willing to spend. That's a lot of money to me, so the long-term reliability cost is a realistic concern. I could have gone a little more than $35,000 and maybe gotten like a decent GTR, but again, I didn't like them enough to justify spending that much more than the price point that I could get a Viper at. But going back to kind of the practical year-round vehicles, the Evo and the STI were on my list, but the problem with those is the resale value is astronomical compared to what I think the performance level is. Around me, all the Evo 8s and Evo 9s are completely rusted out. They got like 115 to 150,000 miles, and they're still going for $20,000 to $35,000. That's a lot of money to pay for a rotted out 20-year-old car. Even the Evo 10s, they're coming up on 10 years old at this point, and most of them were going in the $30,000 ballpark. And the top trim, the GSR, is only available in automatic for the Evo 10s. For me, I couldn't find a good enough deal on any of those cars locally because so many people love them because they can be used year-round. So the prices around here are just absurd compared to what I think they're actually worth and how I think they perform. Now, I did consider some modified ones, and I mentioned this with the Focus ST as well to try to bump up the performance. And I said, you know, what if I spend like 20 grand on something and then I put, even if it's $5,000 into the performance aspect, and then I can have something that's a complete street machine. So the next thing I really looked at was some modified cars. And I looked at absolutely everything. I looked at like LS swapped RX-8s. That would probably be $15,000 to $20,000 by the time the swap was done. I looked at turbo 350Zs. I looked at a lot of the twin turbo BMWs. I also considered an E36 328i because you can put elongated reinforced head studs in a thicker head gasket, slap a turbo on it, and then get a semi-reliable 500 horsepower-ish at the wheels and have yourself one heck of a street machine. What I found, especially for the Evos and the Subarus, is that the reliability declined too much when you really get into those high horsepower numbers that I was looking for. And that was also the case with a lot of the twin turbo BMWs. Even though you can make pretty big power for cheap, unless you do other adequate upgrades to kind of cool the system better and do some reliability mods, sometimes the reliability drops off pretty sharply. And while this is supposed to be kind of a fun toy, and while I do enjoy the high horsepower aspect, I've done the highly modified car before and I've done the reliability issues thing before. The highly modified cars just quite frankly cannot stand up to that much track abuse for that prolonged period of time. For the same reason, I didn't want to go into a lot of the supercharged vehicles from the factory. So I did consider the ZL1 Camaros, I considered C7 Z06s, and I considered GT500 Mustangs. The problem with all of those is they are very prone to overheating on the track, but they do make some great horsepower numbers and they are very cool cars. But even when I was looking a couple of years ago, they were at the top end of my budget. So I didn't want to spend the top end of my budget to then know that I had to do a lot of modifications to make it into a reliable version of something that I wanted to use. Again, they're fine for street driving and stuff like that, but my intention was to get more of like a track-oriented car. I avoided a lot of the older muscle cars and a lot of the older tuner cars for the same reason. Either reliability or just the handling isn't nearly as good as some of the newer platforms. Technology has made a lot of progress for how cars handle in the last several years. I actually came out of a 2011 Mustang GT, and even though that was a live rear axle car, that handled extremely well for what it was. That thing was actually putting down some pretty decent lap times, and I am not that great of a driver. So going from that to an older Mustang and an older Camaro, I don't think I would have as much fun just because I don't think the chassis is as capable. And while I could throw it around more and while I could kind of dive bomb corners because it's a cheaper vehicle and it's a lot less expensive to write off, the fact is that I'm not really going to be doing 30 or 40 or 50 track days a year. I'm really going to be doing probably about 5. I think the trackability is a necessity at the 5 days per year, but I think the street drivability is more important. And I don't think going from my Coyote Mustang with like 400 horsepower down to an SN95 where I have like 250 to 300 horsepower, I don't think that step back would really be that enjoyable for me. For that reason, a lot of the old muscle cars got ruled out. I really did consider the C5 Z06. I also very strongly considered a C6 Z06. That checked almost every box for me, and that was a very hard one to walk away from.